Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to How to Become an Ordained Minister, a live webinar hosted from Knox Theological Seminary. We are based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. My name is Matt Till. I'm the Director of Communications here at Knox, and I'm joined today by Dr. Robbie Crouse, Associate Professor of Systematic Theology, and also our Program Director for the Master of Divinity program here at Knox. We are both very glad to be with you and glad that you're joining us for this. What we think is going to be an interesting topic, how to become an ordained minister. Robbie, I feel like not many people are asking this question often, but when I posed it to you, you told me that you get this question a lot, actually.
Yeah. So especially for the MDiv program at Knox, which is our kind of main ministerial degree, I guess you'd say. I mean, we do a number of different things at Knox, and the MDiv is particularly of the master's degrees look toward training pastors. And so, as people might feel led toward this, they say, okay, I think I might want to be a pastor. I think that means ordination, right? How does that work? And so, yeah, oftentimes I do get that question, and glad to field it today.
Well, I'm really glad that you're joining us and giving up some of your busy schedule to do this today with us and to answer some of those questions that those who are joining us live or might be watching this later who are probably asking some of the same questions. And so we're here to at least help navigate those waters as best as we can from a seminary position. Just a reminder to those who are attending with us live, we are recording this. And while we don't see you or hear you, because this is a webinar format, we do invite you to ask questions. And so please use the Q&A function. We'd ask not to use the chat, but the Q&A function here in Zoom at the bottom of your screen to leave your questions, and we will try to answer as many of them as possible in the time allotted today. And I'm going to be just asking a number of questions that we already know to ask at least Robbie here, and we're going to get started here in just a moment. And then afterwards, we'll give you an opportunity to learn more about the MDiv program here at Knox as well too, and just offer you a quick link as a way for you can get some quick information available to you by email right from us to learn more about our program here at Knox. Robbie, let's just get started. First of all, let's just cover the basics. What does it mean to be an ordained minister?
Yeah, well, I mean, so, Knox is a Protestant seminary. We trace our kind of lineage from the Protestant Reformation and certainly beyond that, but of the great rediscovery of the gospel at the Reformation. And one of the things that was important at the Reformation is actually kind of pre-ordination, which is that every believer is a priest in Christ. Every believer is called in Christ. We'll use the phrase, the priesthood of all believers from Martin Luther. So even before we get to kind of the idea of what's a pastor, one of the things I actually try to emphasize is that every Christian is called to exercise ministry. And Paul's actually very clear about that in the New Testament, that even the work of ministers is to equip the saints to do ministry. So before we even get to kind of ordination, it's always great to kind of just encourage the saints, encourage the body. Everybody's called to do ministry. It's not an option if you're a Christian. You're in Christ. God's called you. We sometimes in theology can distinguish between what's sometimes called a primary call and then a functional call. And the idea is God calls you to salvation. And that's the primary call. It calls you to be in Christ, to live in Christ, to do good and be in his body. And then he also gives you a functionary, like a functional call, which that might be a call to different kinds of ministry that are involved. And it may just be a lay ministry. We want to emphasize that God gives gifts to everyone. And the New Testament emphasizes that, gifts of service, gifts of mercy. But within that kind of broader sense of everybody's called to do ministry in Christ, who belongs to him, there's also kind of this more functional call that says there's in particular a call for those to exercise leadership, to shepherd the flock, to give oversight over God's people. And it is a special call. We want to emphasize both that it's not superior to another call. So that's, I think, key is that every call is right, that God gives every person, their position and place in the church. But it's a sacred call, and we're glad to encourage those to seek pastoral office. You think of biblical passages that says if you desire to be an overseer, that's a good thing. That's great. That's your aspiration, is to be in leadership in God's church. So ordained ministry then would basically say ordination is the word basically for choosing, that the congregation chooses, calls a person to set aside them to exercise their time, leadership, gifts for the sake of the whole church. So, one of the things that we can kind of get into even here right now is the idea that if a person, wants to do this, we can say something about an internal call, which is kind of the idea of you should want this probably, right? There should be a sense of, I feel led to. And then the other part of ordination is actually an external kind of confirmation of that, which is that other people recognize, wow, you do have a gift. So I often, work with students and others on this of kind of getting both sides to that, where someone can say, I really feel like I should be a pastor. And then my kind of often response back is, oh, that's great. I mean, are there others who kind of recognize that and see, your gifting? Or on the opposite, I'll sometimes call out certain people and say, hey, everybody thinks that you really are, equipped, gifted to be a pastor. Do you feel led to this? Because in a sense, everybody around you seems to think that this would be a great place for you to exercise your gifts. So anyway, all that to say is, an ordained minister is chosen by God's people, led by God's Spirit, gifted to shepherd in the flock.
Robbie, I really appreciate you talking about this idea of the calling, one that's comes from outside of oneself and one that comes from kind of within, obviously Spirit led. But speak a little bit more, like, do you feel like in your experience, is people's calls to ministry, to pastoral ministry, towards ordination, wherever they find themselves in a denomination, is it usually one pathway? Is it always like internal call first, external call, external, internal, or does it seem like everybody's story is a bit unique?
I really do think, everybody's story is a bit unique. We have at Knox here some students who have kind of said something like, I felt this call since I was a kid. I mean, just that I wanted to be a part of the church and lead in the church, while others, a large portion of Knox, and I think this is encouraging maybe to some of the listeners here, it's not something that was kind of right there at the beginning when they became a Christian, when they were called to Christ, is that they were happy to be just a church member and didn't necessarily see themselves in church leadership, but much later in life, they really did feel a call to that internally. Later, maybe others have pointed it out. So it really is unique. I think the point that I was kind of making there is there's a couple of things that should just be there, no matter how they got there. The sense of you feel led to do this, you feel like this is something that is a calling on you, and then others around you surround you, support you, and support that work that you feel called to in that ministry.
What about age? You see a common sense of those who are, depending upon where they're at in terms of their age. I know that there are some like undergraduate Bible programs that are offering 5-6 year bachelor's and then master's degree in order to move towards a fast ordination process as part of a denominational arrangement. Other people kind of come in later in their life. Do you tend to see an age spectrum, or people within a certain period of time in which they decide to pursue ordination at all? Is there a trend, or is it all over the place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is all over the place. I think there is a certain sense in which being called at a young age and being able to kind of devote that formative time of college and education toward that is great. I mean, I think oftentimes I hear our middle-aged Knox students say, I wish I had kind of this was clearer to me younger, and I could have dedicated some of my college credits and time at that point when I was a little more kind of open to changing kind of life careers and paths. But I mean, I think all that to say is we have biblical examples of those who were called early in life, kind of the Samuels who are called just at a very young age, and those who are quite middle-aged, and it was kind of a bolt from the blue, and God wants that. And so I think wherever you are, I think it should be encouraged to say these are different pathways that God has used to bring people into ministry.
Speak a little bit to the different types of credentialing. I recognize that it can be quite different across denomination, but speak a little bit to the different types of credentialing that somebody who's thinking about this or beginning to wade into those waters that they may encounter, maybe the different terminologies, difference between ordination and licensure, for example.
Yeah, so one of the things that's going to be difficult in this conversation is just, the sheer number of denominations and languages that we kind of terms that we use for this. I mean, pretty much everybody uses ordination, which the ordination usually refers to the laying on of hands, so the setting aside of a person, and that they're called to this particular office of church leadership. But even that office, we kind of all use the term pastor, but some will talk about an elder, teaching elder versus ruling elder. There's kind of different terms that are used there. Even as you mentioned, that sometimes some steps that lead up to ordination, but are kind of an intermediary step. So a number of Reformed and Presbyterian denominations will talk about being licensed, which is always kind of fun. Licensed to preach kind of sounds like James Bond, Licensed to Kill. You've got your preaching license, but the idea is that in those denominations that do licensure, it's basically saying, we see and recognize that you have a calling and have gifting to preach, and this is kind of the first step along the way, but we would want to do some more examination, kind of going through the process to a full pastorate, where we would kind of send you off on your own, as it were, to be a pastor. I myself was licensed several years before being ordained, so that there was a sense of we think you should preach. We also want you to continue to grow and learn and be developed as a minister to do the kind of greater pastoral work of shepherding and counseling and those kinds of things. As far as just the process to that ordination, is different for each denomination. Some really are emphasizing the education prior to that process. And so the idea is, okay, first go get seminary, and then we'll kind of start the process once that's done. For many others, particularly, our Baptists, and I'd say a lot of non-denom, churches, ordination can happen very quickly, and they recognize that you're gifted or ready or feeling called to do this, and so they'll ordain and then send you to seminary, so that you've been ordained, and now go get the rest of the education to kind of actually grow and use that ordination to minister. So it really just kind of depends on the different denominations. So one of the things I'd say to students, and I often do, is find out about your denominational pathway. What are the requirements? What does it normally look like? And in particular, one of the things I say too is, so much, this is actually true of the secular world, quote unquote, as well, but of networking and kind of mentoring relationships, but especially true in the body of Christ, which is find somebody that, in your church or local church denomination or wherever, that you can say, I really want to be mentored into this, and not just kind of reading it online to figure out what the requirements are, but someone can lead you through that process, who's been there before, who maybe will be a part of the process itself. So I think it's a really good first step if someone's kind of hearing this and saying, where do I start? And I'd say, we'll start with asking someone in your local body, to kind of mentor you through this process.
I think it's really helpful, Robbie, in terms of a great place for us to start is obviously ordination begins in the church context. It begins in the church body, within the church community, with your leadership that is already there, and the community of fellowship of believers and the saints that you already are around and existing within you, or within your sphere of influence, and those who are obviously affirming you. So just to be clear, does a Master of Divinity guarantee you an ordination?
Yeah, no, and that's actually really important that we always kind of clear that with students right away, which is, a Master of Divinity can open up all kinds of possibilities for ordination. And I would say this, in many denominations, the MDiv is the expected degree of ordination. I think some of that's changing, and you and I have actually had conversations, other webinars that we've talked about kind of the changing landscape of seminary education and churches. But in general, that is still the kind of just baseline degree for those who want to be ordained. The idea is that the MDiv will give you all of the tools that an ordained pastor would want to do, which is, the knowledge, the Bible knowledge, the theological knowledge, as well as the practical stuff too. So the MDiv at Knox has our courses in preaching, our courses in leading worship, in handling ministry situations. We're offering some more electives than we've had, as it relates to counseling and personal evangelism and discipleship. And those are kind of all housed within the MDiv program. Our other degree, the MABTS, is a really great baseline degree for other reasons too. And you can kind of add to that.
So MABTS being the Master of Arts in Biblical and Theological Studies, which contains the majority of the core courses of the MDiv program, but is reduced hours, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So the MDiv is 90 credits. The MABTS, Master of Arts, is 60 credits. And in general, those 30 extra credits are the ministry, practical, applied theology classes, those kinds of hands-on. So, we have some of our MA students take some of those classes, the kind of MDiv type classes for their electives. And so they get kind of like a mini MDiv. And, we're not, against that. And we, if that can work for your denomination, then that's great. I think we in general, try to kind of, if you're interested in being a pastor, the MDiv is, a degree that can open up a number of different possibilities. So, one of the questions that people often ask is, what can I do? What kind of things does the ordination open up, or what would I, what are the possibilities for that? And so, the normal ordination kind of typical pathway, we just mentioned here, is a local church body connected to a denomination, or maybe just a local church body that's independent, non-denominational, but kind of starting with the local church body. But, it's the case that a lot of our MDiv students who go on to be ordained, they can be ordained as Christian school teachers. They can be ordained to be Christian administrators in schools, or a campus ministry is another big one. We have a number of our students who seek ordination and then use that ordination primarily in a specific ministry context, kind of outside of the local church, in a more parachurch ministry, campus ministry, chaplaincy. So we have a lot of chaplains. We have some that go into military chaplaincy, medical chaplaincy. What are some of the others I'm thinking here? Just a number of different kind of parachurch ministries that the ordination, basically what the ordination is doing is saying, your church body or denomination or ministry, basically is saying, we support you. We recognize that you're gifted and called to a particular work in God's kingdom, and we're setting you aside, to do that. So that's kind of the larger idea of ordination. So it normally happens in a church body with a pastor or assistant pastor, youth pastor, family pastor, whatever it is within a church context. But it also can be, a wider church context.
So Robbie, back to just kind of like the types of people that pursue ordination. You just gave us a great overview of the career pathways, or those of like at least a ministry calling that somebody may discover, whether they're actively thinking about that today or might be in the future, may discover that as they go through the process. We got a question actually in our Q&A, and this is from Andy. Andy, thanks for sharing your question. And I encourage others to continue fill that Q&A up with some additional questions if you have them. He's referring to himself as that Andy says that he's he runs a small engineering business, and he's an owner, but yet he's kind of in his late 50s, and he's like, hey, is it too late for me? I don't feel like I'm too old to pursue this. What are your thoughts? And Robbie, what are your thoughts about somebody who's found themselves in a career in kind of middle life, kind of going, maybe I need something different, or maybe the Lord's calling me to something else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll start it with a story. And that's, I have a friend who pastors a church just north of here in the Palm Beaches area. So just a little bit, about 30, 40 minutes north of Knox here. And he's a small church pastor, and the church has grown, which has been really great. I mean, even through kind of the COVID times. And he's kind of, the increasing calls to me of saying, I feel really tired, Robbie. I mean, I'm actually, it's a great tired in the sense of I've got more to do as there's more people. And so, he and I kind of together were praying about, I said, well, you need an assistant pastor. You need someone to help you out. And he was a solo pastor. And he's like, I just don't know. Like, I don't know, where that would come from, who that would come from. And basically at the same time, kind of unbeknownst to the two of us, there was an elderly, somewhat elderly man in the congregation, very similar, just, sort of a regular business guy, who had been feeling more and more called, like he would like to use his life and work to serve in the church. And so he came to my friend not long after we talked and said, is this crazy? But I feel like I would want to help you and on a full-time basis to serve in the church, as a pastor, as an elder, however I can. And is it too late for me? And my friend basically just said, this is providential, man. This is not too late. This is perfect. And he started taking some online classes, doing seminary work as he was beginning the ordination process himself. And so it took a couple of years, but not too long. And now he's basically come to the place where he's got an assistant pastor, and it's great. I mean, this guy's bivocational now, so he's going to hold on to some of his own kind of business work, but is helping out the church, and it has been a complete relief for my friend as a now senior pastor, and it's been great for the church. The church has really celebrated this man, and the extra work that he's doing for the church, and the way that it's helped everybody. So no, my answer is, if you look at your situation and there could be things that you kind of have to think about, the difficulties of kind of switching careers and what that would look like. So I think that would be individual, unique to each person, but don't count it out, I guess would be what I'd say, particularly if you talk to your church body, people there, and if you kind of approach it and say, I want to serve, I want to use my gifts in this way. You might be surprised how some people might say, that's great, and we want you to serve, and that's kind of, that's the call that God has given to many people. So yeah, don't count yourself out.
And Jeremiah, thanks so much. I just saw your message, and just kind of your sharing that you're 74 years old and felt the call back in your teenage years and didn't get your MDiv until 2018, and you're a retired principal, and you're still seeking a call and waiting for that moment maybe to serve in some sort of capacity. So Jeremiah, our prayers are with you, and just thanks so much just for sharing that. And young or old, I think that many are want to serve and find a place to serve in Christ's church. This is a great question. That what if I'm in a church that actually doesn't ordain ministers? You talked a little bit about the non-denominational world. Obviously, denominations usually have some sort of ordination process built in. But what if you're kind of in that world, the non-denominational, or you're thinking about church planting or doing something of that nature? Does ordination matter in that case or not? What would you say to somebody who's kind of outside of the mainstream denominations?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I'd say is, there's actually surprisingly little in the New Testament about what we would call ordination and its process. We have, passages where, Paul is describing overseers and leaders in the church. And, he says things like they should be qualified, able to teach. He says to deacons, for example, that they should be tested first. And so we don't have a sense of like, here's ordination. It's a clear sort of answer on that. So my response to that, for a lot of non-denom folks is, you may not have the word ordination, but you kind of have the concept, which is that you're not just going to pick anybody who just became a recent Christian, doesn't know the Bible, and say, hey, you're preaching this week. That's a rarity. Usually the idea is that the call and the having someone go through a kind of training process or some kind of way of recognizing their gift or their ability. Sometimes I've said, that it's really about qualification and not education even. So are you qualified to do it? Are you able to? That's Paul's language, able to teach. And so for most, that's why we say, come to seminary and we'll help you in that being able to teach, qualified to teach, but not everybody does. And not everybody has a denomination that has this very strict process. And sometimes that can be a good thing. And so, to the non folks of saying, yeah, my church doesn't have any kind of, label for ordination or process. Well, the idea is, well, then speak to your pastor, speak to the leaders of the church and say, what would it take? How could you recognize some of the abilities and gifts that I have to teach, and ask them about ways that you can serve and on that. So yeah, the local and kind of non-denom church might have some advantages and some disadvantages, I guess, just that there's not a uniform process across the board. But usually if you can find out how they consider people ready to be involved in the work of church ministry.
Why are some people ordained and others not, potentially? And even related to this question, Robbie, can women be ordained? I know that can be a hot button issue depending upon where you're at or where you're coming from or your particular theological perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain denominations that have kind of wide, I'd say, views of ordination. So, I mean, I've actually seen some of this in some denominations that will, I asked the question earlier, I said that some, Christian schools, that it's actually very important for some Christian schools that the headmaster be ordained, even though he's not necessarily what you would consider a pastor of a congregation. For some denominations, that's very important. So their view of ordination is a little bit wider than just sort of the main preacher or somebody who teaches and preaches in the church, but administration, that kind of thing. Again, in general, the ordination is kind of, the idea is that beyond sort of your nursery worker or Sunday school teacher, somebody who's making important decisions and having some accountability in the church and involved in that leadership, is kind of how who gets ordained, or who, when are you just simply a lay teacher in the church, which, I think many churches have. Just the idea of somebody saying, look, I don't think of myself as a pastor, but I love teaching Sunday school and I love, helping out with the youth. We've got a lot of Knox students that's kind of their pathway through Knox as a seminary, which is that I don't really feel called to an office in the church per se, but I want to be better equipped to help others. And then, by the way, it's a good reason. I mean, we're glad to help in that as a seminary. As it relates to women in ministry and women ordination, I mean, my answer to that is it really depends on the denomination. Knox doesn't necessarily take a stance on that in terms of, because we don't ordain. I mean, that was kind of going back to your earlier question. The MDiv is not Knox's ordination of you. So Knox doesn't ordain, so we don't need to say, since we don't ordain, who should be ordained. I mean, in general, what Knox tries to do is to say, if your denomination or church sends you to us, or if you're coming to us, we want to equip you in the best possible way to serve in ministry. And so we do have women students, and women students are seeking ordination. And so we'll try to equip them in the best possible way that we can for their denomination. Some of us take a yes answer to this question at Knox, some would take no. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter from our education standpoint. We are simply wanting to equip people to know and teach the Bible in the best way they can, and that denominations will kind of divvy that out as it regards to men only, to men and women, what that really looks like.
This kind of goes back a little bit to a previous webinar that you and I did. But what is the value to ordination in general? Even to this day, I know, like, probably historically, and you could talk us a little bit through this more. But historically, it seemed like ordination was kind of like you went to the ordained minister to marry and bury, and that doesn't seem culturally as relevant or as even important any longer. And so it seems like potentially there may even be a slowdown in interest in ordination in denominations. Statistics, I think, are starting to tell us that. Is there still a value to ordination for those who are maybe even thinking about it? What would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right to say that ordination doesn't have the weight that it does, previously, where there was kind of even kind of in secular culture, like you're saying, that there's kind of this respect of, I want an ordained minister to marry us, well, even though they don't go to church, or to bury me or something like that. Some of that kind of general Christianized culture that maybe is a bit past, and sort of where we're definitely moving beyond. So yeah, I mean, there's not it doesn't open you up to maybe the kind of larger cultural weight that it used to have. But I will say this, you might be surprised at how much that there still is some of that. I've actually seen that as it relates to hospital visits and hospital visitation. If you've ever wanted to visit church members in the hospital, sometimes kind of flashing if you actually have kind of I got mine, I think, in my drawer over there, my ordination card. I don't carry it around. It's not something I'm doing a whole lot with, but if I go to the hospital, I will actually bring it. And it can be helpful. They say, oh, okay, you're an ordained minister. Sure, you can come on through. We're not really letting anybody family right now, but since you're an ordained minister, we'll allow you. I mean, there are times in which that's the case, in which, appealing to that. And, it's kind of like maybe other professions, if you wanted to make an analogy of, can anybody do certain medical things on our kids, bandage up their wound on our kids or something like that? Sure, but you're going to want somebody who's got the kind of license, as it were, to do the operation, on you if it's a pretty serious one. And so, having the ability to say, my denomination, I went through a process. My denomination said that I'm ready, and that they granted me the credentials of ordination. That can open up, things for you to move in different areas that can be really helpful. Simply listing it on your kind of resume, as it were, might say, okay, so this guy's not just a kind of self-ordained. He doesn't just think he's ready. Other people have actually recognized that he's gifted, qualified, to do ministry. So, I mean, that's kind of the larger, just like, does it give benefits kind of externally? I will say this, just as a more kind of personal note, I guess you'd say, is ministry is hard. And I think everybody who knows that, knows it. I mean, there are times and ups and downs in church ministry, whether you're ordained or not, really, but, particularly for ordained ministry, that this is your career, this is your office, this is everything that you're doing. And to be able to look back on your ordination days, something that I have myself have done, and saying, like, God, am I really qualified to do this? Is this really what you want me to do? I mean, this is really hard. And to be able to have, as I've sometimes had, a memory of the prayers that were prayed over me, at my ordination, asking God to bless my work and to bless me in ministry. That's been encouraging. So the idea of ordination is, Paul even does this with Timothy. I think it's it's in 1 Timothy 4, I think it is, that he talks about, not neglecting the gift, when the laying on of hands, so he's calling Timothy to remember that, in a way to say, hey, look, others have supported, have seen this, take that as encouragement when the times are difficult. So, having an ordination process, some kind of accountability that others recognize this, I'd say is very personally, existentially important in a life of ministry that can be difficult, that you can look back to and say, no, I really was called to this. And other people recognize it too. I mean, I think everybody will have that moment of, did I mess up the call? Like, did I really God was telling me something else and I took the wrong turn? And what the ordination does is say, no, others have actually said, we think this too. As a community, we recognize that you're called for this.
I appreciate you just sharing that real personal connection too, and realizing that ordination is not just about climbing a professional career ladder, but it is a true calling. It's a true test on the human soul, and also understanding just that it is a personal drive, a personal calling, something that does really require some maybe even a little bit of grit and a whole lot of faith along in the way, right? We got a great question here. Just kind of going back to the question for those within non-denominational circles, perhaps wondering, is there some sort of a test out there or an exam one would want to go through or try to, in order to receive an ordination process? Where would somebody go? What would somebody do then? Because if the Master of Divinity doesn't actually automatically make you ordained, maybe just a quick backtrack as to who does ordaining, and then is there a test somebody could take necessarily?
Yeah. So, I mean, the who does ordaining would be depending on your denomination, tradition, church context. It's either the local church body, like just the local church. Could be a board of elders, could be just the senior pastor, or it could be the congregation itself is considered the sort of ordaining body. In my own denomination, the PCA, it's considered the presbytery, which is the region of churches that then, together makes up the denomination. And I just say, yeah, is there a test or exam? That's just going to depend on the denomination. So my PCA denomination has a number of exams actually that are both written and oral that we administer. And you can, depending on, what kind of area you're in, you could write me and say, hey, what do those exams look like? I'd be interested just to see. A lot of times they're not secret. They're not like sort of publicly out there, like where you can just type in sort of ordination exam that, they're going to get lots of hits. But, if you write to some different leaders in the PCA denomination, they might share some of the exams that we use or others. But, I'd say, again, I've had a number of friends go through non-denom ordination, and a lot of times it's just an oral exam and it's not necessarily something written down, but the idea is that you have kind of like an interview. I mean, just like you might think of as with a job. If you're applying for a job, you're often going to have an interview. So they're going to ask you some questions. Why are you doing this? Tell me about your family life. Tell me about where you've been to, prepare yourself for this. So I'd say a lot of non-denom churches have something like that kind of process. It may be more informal, more of an oral exam, oral interview on that. But it might be worth Googling. I mean, really, just, typing in a search engine and saying, what are some examples of ordination exams? They might widely differ from, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Anglican. But, again, I'd say most churches have some kind of process, even if it's not stated up front or very formal. It would be something like, we just want to make sure that you are called and that we can get a sense of your abilities and knowledge about things. So I don't know if that's terribly helpful, but it's part of the landscape we live in that we're kind of all over the place denominationally.
The Protestant movement has created so many opportunities, and yet it's a bit of a very free-spirited area sometimes when it comes to this, and a lack of unity. But if I could even just say, in my own experience, I come actually out of a non-denominational background, and I actually found it to be the case as I was exploring these questions myself, is that in almost every non-denominational church, if you go to their bylaws, within the bylaws, there is some sort of mention of an ordination process built within it to be a licensed church. So if they have registered themselves as a non-for-profit church, religious organization, they have to have some sort of piece in there. What does it mean to be ordained or licensed or even commissioned? And so that process probably exists within the church. Now, whether the church and its leaders, its eldership or bishops or whatever they call them, or deacons, or the board of directors, whether they are actually using that or if they've actually fully unleashed it to its full potential, will vary across depending upon your church. But you may just need to go ask your senior pastor. You may just need to look into the bylaws and take a look at it and see what process is there, and then begin to work with your leadership in terms of what would it look like for me to, what requirements would you ask of me in order to receive a ordination license from this church and from this organization?
It's a great point, Matt. I mean, just, it's a funny thing, but in our country, ordination matters for tax purposes. So, I can claim housing allowance for being an ordained minister. So I think it often is to the advantage of churches to kind of make sure they list out that they do have ordained ministers as it relates to some of the tax breaks that they can get. I guess we could list that as an advantage among others, for however long it lasts in this country. It is something that you can take advantage of in that way. So yeah,
that's right.
I mean, to come back on something, Matt, you mentioned there, and I know I hit it before, but I'll hit it again, because one of the other things that I see at Knox is, we have not just non-denom students, but students who are kind of traveling between denominations, to say it that way. My last church was this, my earlier church was that, I'm here now. And they often ask me, where should I minister? Where do I fit? I've got these views on these theological topics, and I'll try to help them say, well, it sounds like you're this, and I could steer you, that denomination would fit well. But, one of the things I would share then is, and again, there's a kind of analogy to this in the secular world of just business, but it's important that you don't just kind of begin to follow the process on your own. I mean, it is so important to find networks and mentors. The other part of that is too, I think sometimes when we look at the different denominations, it's kind of the grass is greener on the other side kind of thing of, man, I'm in my local, such and such denomination. It seems like a mess, but man, your denomination over there, it looks so great. Like, how do I get into that denomination? And so my first response is always, well, why don't you begin to see before you say, I want to be a leader in that denomination, actually kind of know what the denomination's about, get to know people, attend the church there. In fact, I do tell this to people who are interested in the PCA. My denomination is, it is actually a requirement that you be a member of a PCA church for 6 months, which is the idea is you can't just sort of apply for try to become ordained when you've never attended a PCA church. They actually, I think this is wise, but say, all right, well, show up at a PCA church for 6 months and be a member so you can kind of know what we're about before you basically say you want to be a leader in this denomination. It's not necessarily like that for every denomination, but I think it's a wise thing to say, if you're considering multiple denominations or networks of church and ministry, before you kind of jump in and say, I want to be ordained with them, get to know it. I mean, see what it's like on the ground so that I have had, unfortunately, some students that have kind of had the bad end of that, where it's, again, it seems like from the outside, this is a great denomination. I read all your stuff on the website. It's like, oh, it looks great. I'm going to start the process of ordination with you guys. And then basically when they get in there, it's like, this place is a mess. It's like, I mean, all of our churches are a mess in one sense, but they've gotten there and they said, I actually don't fit. And if I had given a sense of wanting to know what this denomination or church was like, that I may have realized that we're just not a fit for one another earlier.
A couple of last questions that are just kind of coming in here now as we wrap up our time here in the next couple of minutes for you, Robbie. One is kind of actually a question that relates more to like ageism. Does age matter when it comes to ordination? Or, if you're maybe like later on in life and look, you've maybe got the degree, the experience. Have you seen cases of ageism potentially when it comes to being hired, or is there some sort of, what would you say to the trends are? I mean, I don't know if we've got any, the hard and fast rules when it comes to age, but potentially that could play into it. Maybe not. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I mean, what we're asking here is, what should it be? And then what's it like on the ground? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd like to say by should, I mean, as I said, we have biblical examples of people late in life being called into leadership and work in God's kingdom and people that I think shouldn't bar people from later in life, if they have the abilities and the logistics, you might say, of switching careers or whatever, of doing this. I mean, I think it shouldn't. Now, I think, as you're pointing out, the on the ground reality is, yeah, I mean, there is a trend you can probably see this in a lot of churches that say things like, man, we want a young pastor because they're going to draw the young people. And, I always encourage churches to not have that attitude where it's like, just because someone's young doesn't mean they're going to necessarily, appeal to the young people. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom that comes with age. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that there are some trends toward that, and it can be more difficult, I'd say, for people later in life to kind of make the inroads. I don't think that's the case everywhere. I think there are people that recognize that that is legitimate and it's good, and there's a lot to be offered from that. But you kind of just have to see what's out there. And I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah. And regrettably, you're right. I think sometimes we see cases of it, and potentially it's unintentional. But again, it seems like it doesn't need to be that case either.
Yeah.
Another question here is, let's say you are ordained within a church, does it carry over to other churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a good one to ask, because I hadn't mentioned that so far. But yeah, and I actually have a lot of Knox students that do that too, which is that, I'm currently in this denomination. But, as it is the case, our denominations, I'd say, particularly as someone who's Reformed and in the Reformed world, are very close. I mean, that it's kind of just sort of by accident of history that we have different denominations and aren't just one. I mean, there's just very little differences. So that would just take some research. So I can mention some real things. Again, just speaking from kind of personal experience, my denomination receives ministers from kind of sister-ish type denominations. There's an organization called NAPARC, North American Presbyterian Reformed Council, that basically is a number of different denominations that have kind of fraternal relations, as it's called, which is that the idea of that is that there's almost zero, like we just kind of assume that the ministers of other denominations can fill the pulpit for ours and vice versa. And that, if we have someone coming from the OPC, for example, in the PCA, that's a fairly easy transfer. But I would say it can happen on a larger level as well, which is that, we have in our own denomination Baptists who become Presbyterians and say, I've made some switch on my views on some things, and we will, still do some of the exams and things like that. But it's not like you didn't come through our way. It's just a different way to come in. And so we'll certainly examine and make sure that there's a good fit between those things. But it'd be worth for whoever asked that question, just researching if you have a denomination, are there kind of relationships with other denominations? If it's a non-denom church, even a non-denom church often have networks. I mean, I think Matt, you and I have even joked about non-denominational denominations, which is that, you've got that kind of Acts 29 networks and other kinds of networks. And, maybe your church is listed on things like the Gospel Coalition or, there's all these kinds of ministries that will list churches, and there's not a deep kind of denominational structure to this, but the idea is, hey, we have some views together that we hold, some unity on some important doctrinal views and beliefs. So, we're fine for you to, and those are the ways, particularly if you're looking for a church and if someone's saying, I want to try to find a position for me, but I'm not denominational. I'd say, well, look at Christianity Today, look at the Gospel Coalition, look at some of these listings that aren't denominations, and these aren't necessarily going to be denominational websites, but that you might be able to find some compatibility with other churches, and that that they would count your ordination. I mean, it just depends on church to church, but I'd say in general, in the evangelical world, we try to be as friendly and as ecumenical as possible, and receive, our ordinations and licenses and credentials as much as possible, maybe with some of the distinctives that each denomination holds. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Most of those networks do have some sort of process of licensing or ordination usually, and they may just not call it that. But functionally, that's usually what it is. Yeah. So if you're kind of a lone ranger out there in the church planting world, getting connected with a broader network of some sort may actually allow you to pursue that process.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things where, this is kind of under the category of ordination, but it really it's about accountability too, which is that, that's kind of another, Matt, you'd ask, what are still the value of ordination? And I kind of mentioned, some of the personal reasons, but I'd say the other is accountability. What ordination does is say, now we hold you to something. And it can be dangerous in a sense to have that kind of lone ranger. I ordained myself, I planted my own church. Certainly that can happen, but if it does, then immediately try to network and try to have association with other churches, that there can be a sense of accountability, that they can speak into issues that are going on into the church, that you can have others to be able to simply have, fellowship with too. I mean, you're not just like, this is the only church I know and I don't know anything else, that you can have fellowship with other Christian bodies that they'll be enriching for you. So, ordination doesn't have to have all of that, but at least have some kind of ways in which you have those accountability and association, fellowship, that's important. And like you said, there's kind of all these different networks that will be umbrella organizations for you that can do some of that. I mean, it's like that in the missionary world too. Missions agencies are not always denominational, but they're trying to provide some accountability financially, as well as just support for one another in that. And I think, I do think that's really important.
Yeah, that's perfect and wonderful. And I think giving us a big, broad spectrum of the whole arena is not as clear cut as we'd like it to be. But it sounds like what I'm hearing from you is it's a partnership between a seminary that educates and prepares, and then the church, or we'll just call it ministry, that does the ordination, and where the relationships are built. And really, actually, that's the heartbeat behind Knox Theological Seminary, is that we are intended, our whole mission is to be in, with, and for the church. And we say the church, but we use that term very broadly. And so for us, it's this concept of in, with, and for Christ's body, the body of Christ, people and those who are called to ministry and beyond. And so for us, we're really committed to wanting to support and serve the church in any capacity, and specifically the one that we do best, and that is educate and help prepare. And so for us, we want to be a resource for those who are considering ordination or wanting to pursue that career in that future in ministry. Robbie, thank you so much again for your time today. And just on this day, we're just grateful that you've given us all this information and help. We want to encourage you who are listening in, if you want to learn more about the Master of Divinity program here at Knox, I'm putting a link right now in the chat for you. You can request more at discover.knoxseminary.edu/MDiv. Again, that's discover.knoxseminary.edu/MDiv. And when you go there, you're just going to put your name, your email address in, and then you're going to get an email right back from us. And just going to give you more information about our Master of Divinity and a lot of the frequently asked questions about Knox. Who are you? What's your history? Where can I get more information about financial aid? All that kind of stuff that will get just sent to you right away. And then that also provides you an opportunity to get in contact with us further if you want to learn more, or consider even taking some courses, or even considering a program with us. We'd love to have you join us and to learn more. And of course, too, please follow Knox on any of your favorite social media apps. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And then, of course, later on, you're going to be able to find this program, this recording, as well as going to be on our YouTube page. I just blasted a bunch of those links to you. If you're a social media follower, feel free to follow us on any one of these platforms if you're not doing so already. And you can continue to engage with us and continue the conversation with Knox there. And with that, we're just grateful for your time, and we're grateful. Please be sure that when you watch this, you share it with others, and we're here to be a resource for you. Again, thanks so much. And Robbie, thank you again for your time today.
Absolutely. Yep.